I want to talk to you today about perspective because our perspective can either help or hinder our walk with God. And what do I mean by that? Well, we either can take on a spiritual perspective or a natural perspective, but it's really hard to take on both. I want to give you an example. The other day, I had to borrow my mom's car, and I would say like majority of my life, her car wasn't like super clean. But lately, now that she doesn't have like kids carting around, her car is almost a disaster all the time. And I say that so nicely. I'm not trying to like be mean or whatever. Like my car's a mess too. But I borrow her car and I get in and I'm picking my kids up. And obviously my kids can't sit in the front seat. And I look in her back seat and all the seats are down and there's just like a ton of stuff everywhere. And I'm looking in her back seat like, dude, her car is a mess, right? And I don't really like look at what's going on in the car. I just see this giant mess, right? So I get in my car, I go to pick my kids up, and I knew when I opened the back seat, they were immediately going to start complaining about like, where are we going to sit? And there's crap all over the car, right? So my kids get in and my son Michael gets in first and he goes, wow. And here I'm expecting him to say like, her car is a disaster. He gets in, he says, wow, grandma is like the biggest helper ever. She's wonderful. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, look at all this landscaping stuff in her car. She makes the church beautiful with all of this stuff. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like why? You know what I mean? Like it's a perspective shift. Like I just looked at a car full of a bunch of junk, but like had I really looked at it, I would have understood that they just had the workday. And honestly, my mom is like the 73-year-old lady who is constantly picking up our church's grounds. Like she's constantly picking up trash and planting flowers and just wants to beautify our entire church facility on the outdoors, right? So my son gets in the car and he obviously sees all the tools that she uses to make the church beautiful. And I was then reminded of our perspective and how our perspective really has an impact on our spiritual walk. So I want to take you into Numbers with me. And in Numbers, if you remember, the children of Israel, they finally get to the promised land and they send in the spies to go look at the promised land. And when they come back, they're reporting back to Moses and Aaron what they saw in the promised land. So what happens is the spies get back and they basically say this. They gave the children of Israel a bad report out of the land which they had spied out, saying the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of the Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So the spies who went in had a perspective of they're giants and we're grasshoppers. Like, how are we ever going to take over this land? However, you go in the following chapter and it talks about someone else and their perspective on how they went in to spy out the land. So it says, but Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, different perspective. The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into the land and give it to us. It's a land which flows with milk and honey. The same group of people went into the same land to spy it out. But one group saw the giants, and when they saw the giants, they were afraid and said, we're just like grasshoppers, in front of these giants. The other two people out of the group, they said, if God desires to give us this land, he's going to do it. And it's a land that's flowing with milk and honey. So in that, I was reminded, we are always going to have a perspective. What perspective are you going to take on? Are you going to take on the natural perspective that constantly sees everything in your life as a struggle, as something that's working against you, and constantly take on this victim mentality? Or are you going to be like Joshua and Caleb, who said, if my God is for me, okay, they didn't say that, but if my God is for me, who can be against me, right? And they walked in and they said, if God desires to give us this land, we know that he can do it because it's the promised land. So I just want to encourage you to look at your perspective and figure out what perspective you have and make sure it's the spiritual one so that it can help your spiritual walk with God.